On the morning of December 8, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door, and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find 2 sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. but Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. Basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? She couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to an eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Foust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Foust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Foust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Foust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Foust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Foust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Foust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Foust immediately saw what he was talking about. There was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Foust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Foust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. It's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Foust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Foust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Foust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Foust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Foust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard, and when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Foust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Foust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Foust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Foust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Foust, very gently, asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before, when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Foust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Foust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Foust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Foust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Foust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Foust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Foust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Foust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Foust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Foust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Foust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Foust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Foust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Foust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Foust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Foust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie. But just then, Foust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Foust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Foust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Foust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Foust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Foust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Foust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Foust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day. You know those moments right before you start something new, when you're staring at the idea, running through every worst-case scenario, and wondering if you're making a huge mistake? That feeling of doubt and uncertainty can be paralyzing. But looking back, making that leap, despite the fear I had, was one of the best decisions I ever made when I started this Mrballen adventure. Because sometimes the scariest step forward is the one that changes everything. Starting something new isn't just hard, it really is terrifying, especially when you're starting a business. But that's why it helps to have such a great partner like Shopify by your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses all around the world, from household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to brands just getting started. It's time to turn those what-ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/Mrballen. Go to shopify.com/Mrballen. Again, that's shopify.com/Mrballen. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Foust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Foust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Foust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Foust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Foust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car it was heartbreaking. And so Foust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Foust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Foust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Foust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Foust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they had come back with a match that really surprised Detective Foust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Foust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Foust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Foust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Foust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Foust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Foust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Foust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out, because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample, and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Foust answered his office phone and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Foust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Foust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbaczewski. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Foust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Foust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Foust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Foust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Foust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy, and when Foust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Foust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and he got one and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Foust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Foust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Foust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Foust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Foust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before, they sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked, and they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in, and they found Bonnie, asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked, and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer, and the killer knew they had to strike. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The killer completely overpowered her. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse, and when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed, and after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert, where they parked on the side of the road. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Foust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Foust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors, who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie, told Foust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Foust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Foust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But What they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch House was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch House. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch House could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch House had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch House became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew really he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him, but then eventually he turned around and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch house where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch house, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers, and even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window, but he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around. And this time, he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, and after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willies in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willies were not in there either, and this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together, they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come from money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, Hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Bosse was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden, because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip, because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrived in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip, and so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive, until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing, and it ignited the bomb, and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself, so shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before this bomb detonated. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, three young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m. they started heading south. south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two, so it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's gonna happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black black-looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment. And suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out." And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it.
And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence, and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze, and he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on. And then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile, and so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift, and it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged
rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with the son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline. And he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? So he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge. And he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away.
When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally, the average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit, so it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so, unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later, at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed, when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely, and if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m. because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m. and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him? And what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?